Okay, so we are recording the meeting. So we will send out both the recording and the slides after the meeting. So if you're not able to see anything, or if you want to share this with your friends or neighbors afterwards, you'll be able to do that. The key is if you just called in like with your phone, we won't have your email to send it out. So it's really important for you to either email me and it's jennifer.dyke, D-Y-K-E at Fort Worth, Texas, all written out.gov. Or you could email Christina at, what was it again, Christina?
Arlington Heights, NA.com. It's
Okay,
Arlington Heights Neighborhood Association.com.
So one of those emails, and we'll make sure that we get y'all the information.
I've got three different things.
It's president at Arlington Heights.
Yes.
Keep interrupting.
Or just your city councilwoman, Councilwoman Hill, District 7. That works too.
You give me like 4 things. Jennifer, whatever.
Just for ease, why don't y'all just email Sammy Ruth in my office or District 7 at the city of Fort Worth, and then we can make sure we get it distributed to the right people.
Perfect.
Okay.
Thank you. That's a great point. If you email anyone at the city, we'll get it to you. So with that, so my name is Jennifer Dyke. I am the Assistant Director of the Transportation and Public Works Department responsible for the Stormwater Management Program. I will introduce our team, but I do want to recognize Councilwoman Hill, who's on the call, and turn it over to Councilwoman Hill to see, so she can make a few opening remarks, and then I'll introduce the city staff that are on the call today.
Well, thank you, Jennifer, and thank you all for attending tonight. And I'm sorry for the technical difficulties. I know that always happens. So whatever we can do to make sure you get the information after the fact, we will do our best to get that to you. But we want to make sure this is an open forum where you can ask your questions and we can get some things answered. We have wonderful staff here, as mentioned, Stephen and Jennifer with Stormwater. Thank you all for taking the time at 6 o'clock on a Wednesday. I really appreciate it. And look forward to hearing the dialogue and the update on El Campo.
Definitely. Okay, well, thank you, Councilmember Hill. So let's see. So today, Stephen Nichols will be giving our presentation. So Stephen is our Stormwater Program Manager, and Linda Stern, who is our communications specialist. So Linda will be helping to monitor the chat. So if you've got questions at any time and you're on the actual virtual meeting, feel free to put them into the chat. Otherwise, we can try to kind of pause or take questions along the way. Those who are in the virtual meeting can also raise their hand, and we can pause kind of at the end of the slides and take questions as we go. And so I think, Stephen, try to kind of maybe pause after every couple of slides. For those of the people who are especially calling in, then it might be kind of harder to get their questions. Trying to see who else is on the call. So we've also got Lisa Biggs from our floodplain, she's our floodplain administrator for the city of Fort Worth. And we've got Leon Wilson as well. And so Leon is our engineering manager in the development services department responsible for stormwater. So we've got Leon, and then we've got Kiran Kunduru as well in our stormwater planning section. I think, Lauren, are you on this call? Is that you, Lauren Prayer? I don't know if there's a Lauren on the call. Okay. She's quiet if she's here. I don't know if it's her or not. So, okay. So with that, thank you again for joining us. And I guess let's go ahead and kick off, Stephen.
So good evening, everyone. Thanks for your time. If you have questions, like Gemma said, feel free to jump in and ask. We have about 50 minutes left, so I'll try and move through the content at a reasonable pace. So tonight I want to provide information about our non-FEMA flood risk area mapping, our city flood risk area regulations, and mention our cumulative impacts initiative that we've been working on. So our non-FEMA flood risk mapping. So I want to start with what our FEMA floodplains are. So in the 1980s, the city started participating in the National Flood Insurance Program. And so with that, we've got our FEMA floodplain maps. So those are sort of our flood insurance rate maps. The FEMA maps typically cover, at least in North Central Texas, they cover creeks and streams and rivers and lakes and those kinds of water bodies. And when things were mapped in the 1980s, FEMA didn't map typically urban areas, and they focused on streams that drained more than a square mile. So what that meant is large portions of the city weren't included in FEMA mapping and weren't regulated for flood risks in that same way. And so today we have more reports or more damages or claims of flood damage outside the FEMA floodplains. So our NFIP participation, our FEMA regulations and the local ordinances around that have been very successful. But outside the FEMA floodplain, there's still more damages. So non-FEMA flood risk areas are those areas outside the FEMA floodplains where we do see more damages. And in a lot of these areas, the cost to resolve that flooding is significant. And it may be many, many years before that can be fixed or mitigated. Therefore, we find that it's better to, at this, today, to regulate and to communicate those flood risks. So this is an example of a FEMA floodplain. So it's a creek with a road crossing. This is actually an image captured by one of our high water warning system cameras earlier this year. And these two photos, at the top left, we've got Magnolia Avenue after a significant storm. And the bottom right, that's actually looking across the street towards Central Market. The Western Arlington Heights area actually drains towards this same location outside Central Market. A couple more photos of what a non-FEMA flood risk might look like. These two photos are taken in the West 7th area. You'll see that the streets are flooded. This car, 2-3 feet of water covering this car. So all these flood risk areas, those were not FEMA, but they look like floodplains. So across the city, we've got different types of floodplain mapping now. So should I pause for questions? Were there any questions about that first piece, that first part?
Stephen, I was wondering, you said that, so the water that's over by El Campo and Pentecost and Pershing, it flows from there over to Central Market?
Yeah, it flows under the freeway
Okay.
and then down towards Hewlin Street.
Okay.
Ultimately, it discharges to the Trinity on the other side of the Union Pacific Railroad yard.
That's not close.
So we've got two types of flood risk. So we've got two types of flood risk mapping. So we've got nearly 50 square miles of FEMA floodplains across the city. We have our area of potential high water, or potential high water areas. That's an advisory type of mapping. It's a low level of detail. It tends to be fairly accurate though in older parts of the city. Parts of the city developed before FEMA floodplains. So the parts of the city developed in the 1920s and 30s, like the Arlington Heights area. And we have our city flood risk areas, which is our newer regulatory flood risk area. So we have 3.5 square miles across the city, mostly within urban areas inside Loop 820, parts of the city that developed in like the 20s, the 30s, and then 1940s. All of this information is available through our flood risk viewer. If you're interested, here's a QR code for it. So sort of zooming into the Western Arlington Heights area, this is an image of the city flood risk areas within your part of the watershed. And again, this is also available through the city's flood risk viewer. There's a lot of detail that goes into the city flood risk area information. There's a lot of detailed engineering behind that. I just want to share an image from one of the reports. So the engineering that is used to determine that flood risk area, it includes the storm drain systems, the topography, the low points, the high points, the inlets, the infrastructure in that watershed. So we consider that to be fairly accurate, and that's why we're regulating through that. This is the potential high water area in the Western Arlington Heights neighborhood. You'll notice that it overlaps fairly closely with the city flood risk area. although this purple shading, this is advisory. So we want to be able to communicate these non-FEMA flood risks to folks like you and the rest of the community. So we can share this information at open houses or public meetings like tonight. So for about 2 years now, the city flood risk area mapping has been available through the flood risk viewer on the city's website. And then earlier this year, we added the potential high water area, which is that advisory information citywide. So prior to the regulations that were effective in July of this year, we really only reviewed, for detailed impacts and drainage, developments of 1 acre or greater. But with this new regulation since July 2024, we would now have some review of development less than 1 acre that's located in those city flood risk areas. That's the orange shading that you saw earlier. Part of that regulation means that there may need to be an engineer involved to help evaluate your project, whether that be elevating the structure or making sure we're not pushing floodwaters to someone else. And that may need a certificate of compliance. So what does this mean for property owners like yourselves? So first of all, we want to make sure that property owners and the community is informed about flood risk. So this means that you can make more informed decisions about your property. One of those decisions might include getting flood insurance. Flood insurance typically applies to FEMA floodplains, but if you know you're already at risk of flooding, then you may be interested in flood insurance, which is available across the entire city, not just inside FEMA floodplains. It also means that if you're doing work in a city flood risk area, maybe you want to add a room to your home or something like that, or you're looking to maybe tear down an existing home and rebuild, that would mean that it is now subject to that city flood risk area regulation if the property is within that orange shaded area. That could mean that you need to hire an engineer or submit a certificate of compliance. Just to get a scale of the impact of what that mapping and regulation might mean for the community, in fiscal year 2023, we looked at all the permits across the entire city, 16,500 permits. And of those 16,500, only 50 permits would have been subject to the new regulations. All right, so city flood risk area regulations. So before July 2024, development less than 1 acre was not required to be reviewed in a lot of detail for drainage, except when a property was platting or subdividing, was located in an existing FEMA floodplain, or was part of a larger common plan development. So what that means is projects that were less than 1 acre may have been potentially flood prone if they're located in one of these city flood risk areas and the design of their development wasn't informed by the flood risk information we have available today. So part of the regulations for city flood risk areas, mention that certificate of compliance. What that means is there's a form, a certificate that be filled out by an engineer that shows an engineer's evaluated the available flood risk information and determined that perhaps the new building or new room addition is elevated or flood proofed above the 100-year flood risk area, and that's not going to have a significant impact on neighboring properties. So there's a few situations, let me pause. So the certificate of compliance and flood risk regulations, those are connected to existing permit types. So if the work that's being done on a property does not require a permit, then there's not a separate city flood risk area permit that applies. So it's always connected to an existing previously required permit. Excuse me. So for example, if a property owner is adding an addition, like another room or extending their home, that may trigger a certificate of compliance. But if the work that's being done is just within the existing footprint of the property or the structure rather, like a new roof, then that would not require a certificate of compliance. Excuse me. there any questions so far? Okay. So the city flood risk area regulations are adopted through the city's floodplain ordinance, the same way that FEMA floodplains are. But the main point of that regulation is that we want new structures to be safe from flooding. And so, new structures would have to be elevated 2 feet or flood-proofed 2 feet above the 100-year storm. And they may require a certificate of compliance, which is the form that an engineer would fill out. And I'll show an example of that here in just a moment. In these two images here, the bottom image showing a home just illustrates what elevating a house might look like if you need to be above a flood risk or flood elevation. And on the top right, I'm showing two examples of where a house might be located. So I don't know if you can see my cursor, but this purple rectangle here, if that structure was located sort of in the middle of that flood area, then a certificate of compliance would definitely be needed because of the potential for flooding to the structure, but also for the potential for diverting flood waters. Whereas this green rectangle, if a structure went in there, it's sort of at the edge of that flooding, shallow, slow. That may still require a certificate of compliance, but I imagine you could work with the floodplain administrator or other staff to figure out how to avoid impacting the floodplain there. So like with all of our ordinances and regulations, we want to make sure that we're always, monitoring and improving where we can. So we plan to continue to evaluate and refine the process and the regulation over time. So I wanted to look at a couple of different examples of city flood risk areas and development within those areas. I understand that within the West Arlington Heights area, there was a zoning case at the corner of, I think it's Pentecost and El Campo. And that work was located in a city flood risk area. Of this image here, I've pulled an image from the engineering report that was used to create the city flood risk information. And so what I wanted to highlight here was the location of the property outlined in red. And the majority of the property is in this very light green color, which tells us in a 100-year storm, so a fairly infrequent event, that there's only 1 to 3 inches of flooding across that property. So the work that was proposed on El Campo and Pentecost, that would have required 2 permits that potentially are connected to the city flood risk areas. So the first was a permit for the fence. The fence that's above 7 feet requires a separate permit. And that fence permit is what actually triggered our review for city flood risk areas on this property. The other permit would be for the concrete flat work, like the sidewalk and the driveway. But because that concrete would be at the same elevation as the existing ground, there really ought not be any impact as a result of that work. And so when we got the zoning case, when we got the building permit for the fence, we looked at that to evaluate how that fence might impact the flow of floodwaters across the property. And staff worked with the developer to make sure that the fence would be modified so there's a gap underneath the fence and that 1 to 3 inches of water could potentially flow underneath the fence. And so because the fence was modified and there wasn't an obstruction to floodwaters, then there was no certificate required for this piece. The flat work or the concrete paving, the parking lot area that's actually on the private property, there's not actually a permit required separately for that work. And therefore the city flood risk area regulations can't be tied to that part of the work as it's currently set up today. I want to share a different example. So this was a real project on the near south side, so south of Magnolia. And here in the red rectangle is a home that they were proposing to extend. The existing home was about 11 or 1,200 square feet, and they're adding nearly an 800 square foot addition to the back of the home. So you can see that in this red rectangle, it's sort of in the middle of that flood risk area. And this almost 800 square foot addition has the potential to obstruct floodwaters. Therefore, it needed a certificate of compliance. So this image on the right, this is the certificate of compliance for this project. It's sealed by an engineer. And so the expectation is that an engineer has reviewed the available flood risk information, perhaps the engineering study, considered how the water is flowing across the property, and then made sure that the project is designed so it's safe from flooding and elevated or flood-proofed, and won't divert runoff to neighboring properties. Let me pause there for a minute and see if there's questions.
So did you allow them to build that? Did that get approved? And what did they do to make it not flood?
So I believe we've cleared, and Leon's on the call, but I believe we've cleared the workflows, or from the stormwater perspective, approved the permit. There may be other departments that have left to approve that, but yes, from the city flood risk area perspective, that was approved. And so what they did was, you've probably seen wooden privacy fences around. My next door neighbor built one recently, and that wooden privacy fence is practically watertight. Right? All the wood panels are together. There's a baseboard at the bottom. It actually diverts runoff, and so we don't want that to happen, especially in a city flood risk area like this. And so staff worked with the developer to change the fence detail, so there's actually a gap underneath the fence, and so any sort of floodwaters would flow underneath the fence rather than piling up behind it. And Lisa and Leon are both on the call if you want to jump in and add to that.
Yes, Stephen, I don't remember all the particulars, but that was the primary solution, was to allow the waters to continue through the property, similar to the parking lot there.
Okay. Brilliant. Okay, any other questions on the El Campo side?
But I think the key point, for both of these sites is, before, when we didn't have our regulations in place, we would never have looked at these. And so that development might not have been informed and taken our flood risk information into account. So that's the key here, is now those developments can be safer, as well as the surrounding areas and residents around them can be safer as well, because the development is taking into account that flood risk, both on the new development as well as on the existing. So there's a benefit both ways for the community.
Thank you.
So Jennifer, I had a question. How does it come to the attention of the stormwater department when somebody applies for a permit? Does somebody look up, is this in the local?
It's flagged in the process now. There's a GIS file, I believe, that flags it. Is that right, Leon? Like,
Yeah.
when someone pulls a permit in these areas?
Yeah, so the Acela system, which is our permitting system, is tied to GIS, as Jennifer mentioned, and it's similar to how we do floodplain as well. So that lot is flagged as having CFRA, and the workflow is generated, and it sends it to stormwater SDS team and development services.
Okay.
And then in order to proceed past that requires a person to actually look at it, evaluate it before that proceeds further. Okay, anything else?
So going back to the El Campo parking lot, so according to the stormwater department, what they're putting there should not negatively impact the nearby neighbors in terms of increased flooding. Is that correct? Is that the idea?
So we've looked at it to determine that it meets our regulations.
So Stephen is going to talk about this next part in terms of cumulative impacts of impervious surfaces. So Stephen, why don't you talk about that, and we can talk about what we're looking at in terms of more and more impervious surfaces across the city.
Got it.
So that was kind of step one, was getting these current regulations in place. to bring up these current properties that we know are in these evaluated flood risk areas up to kind of our current standards. And now Stephen's going to talk about what we're looking at in terms of now our current standards, because we know that there's gaps. And so this is a topic that we've been working on for a while now with stakeholders to try to figure out how we can better improve our regulations to keep more of our communities safe.
Yeah. So our cumulative impacts initiative is what looks at that increased impervious cover across the watershed over time. So this initiative, we kicked it off about 3 or 4 years ago now, but the idea is that, you know, a single project, so we'll use the Ocampo example, right? So one lot with 10 parking spaces doesn't really have a measurable impact across a watershed. So down at Hewlin Street, for example, we wouldn't really be able to measure or quantify the impact of those 10 parking spaces. But if that same work or that same activity was repeated many, many times across the watershed, it would have a measurable impact at Hewlin Street, for example. And so the idea is that, you know, one of these projects individually doesn't really cause a significant impact, but many would. We're looking at two types of cumulative impacts. So on one hand, we've got the impervious cover, so increased runoff within the watershed, as you know, as an urban watershed continues to intensify in development, whether that be, you know, extending or adding rooms to a home, or subdividing and having more, you know, dwellings, things like that. We're also looking at valley storage and the cumulative impact of losing valley storage. And valley storage refers to the volume of water within a creek or a floodplain that temporarily stores floodwaters. So think of it like a bathtub. If you keep shrinking the bathtub, there's less storage within it. And so the same is true of floodplains. And so on one hand, we've got increased impervious cover from a watershed, and we've got decreased storage in the floodplains, which together would accelerate flood risk. So a bit of a timeline. So we started looking at the cumulative impacts more closely in 2020 when we kicked off 2 case studies. 1 case study for each type of cumulative impact we want to investigate. So 1 for impervious cover and 1 for the valley storage. We've had several meetings over the last few years with the Development Advisory Committee, the Infrastructure and Transportation Committee. The team and our consultants have been doing benchmarking. You know, how are other cities handling this? Are they handling it? And then we've also had 5 stakeholder meetings over the last 12 to 18 months. So our stakeholder engagement on this has been fairly extensive in that we work with our stormwater program stakeholder group. That's made up of folks that represent the larger entities that pay into the stormwater utility. We also have a cumulative impact stakeholder group, whether it be residents who have expressed interest or engineers or developers, people who will be touched by this potential policies. They also, you know, so we've got developers, engineers, and city staff on that focus group. We'll also have smaller focus groups. I think those have been more engineering focused. So trying to figure out, you know, together as a community of engineers, how do we document that we're complying with these types of things? How do we solve these problems? We also have our stormwater liaison group, which we work with quarterly on different development concerns. So through that stakeholder activity and the feedback we've received, our plan to move forward is to tackle the valley storage component and have the impervious cover component as a separate process moving forward. So the reason for looking at valley storage first is that is the, you know, relatively speaking, that's the simpler item to tackle. There are already other cities within Texas and within the Metroplex that have requirements or regulations about preserving that valley storage in floodplains. And so we're able to work with a lot of the existing information that developers and their engineers submit to, you know, fairly simply tweak that to show that they're complying with the valley storage regulations. I mean, it is different. It is a different regulation for them, but it should not be a significant impact to the development process overall. We need more stakeholder engagement on the impervious cover part of the recommendations. I believe, and Lisa's on the call, she might be able to correct me, but I believe that the general consensus is that if it's causing impacts, we need to look at look at how we handle that. But the impervious cover and the cumulative impact of that is a more complex issue. And so we're going to still move forward with that, but separate to the valley storage. By middle of 2025, we anticipate taking the valley storage regulations or recommendations for the regulations to City Council for adoption. And that's the extent of the information I wanted to share tonight. So we've still got time for discussion and questions.
So on the topic too of this kind of cumulative impact of impervious surface, I do want to mention that the North Central Texas Council of Governments, who kind of help set standards and recommendations for the greater DFW area, they are also looking into this. And so we are collaborating with them to learn from their findings as well to help inform what we're looking at as well. So definitely trying to take advantage of the benchmarking and data that they're gathering as well.
Stephen, could you show the map again of the Western Arlington Heights? I want to look at where the water's coming from that's coming down to El Campo and Pershing and Pentecost. So what about regulating above, north of us, where it's starting?
So maybe this map is better. So the city flood risk area regulations would apply in these areas too. If they're wherever we have mapping the city flood risk area regulations or city flood risk areas, they would be regulated the same.
And how far up does that go? Does it go up further north? I'm assuming it does. Does it go all the way up to the Trinity north?
It goes to Byers, is about where that stops.
Okay. Okay.
There we go. Thank you.
Wait, I didn't get to hear. Is that Lisa?
Mm-hmm.
Cut off. You're
So-
cut.
I'm muted. I have a separate map up, and now my kitten is annoying. So that I could see how far up it went. So the CFRA, so that city flood risk area, it goes up just a few more blocks up.
Okay.
Where the city stops. The rest of there's kind of a line, like a bridge.
Right.
So the rest of that goes the other direction.
Okay.
So this is the part that comes south, and then once you get over that little ridge, the rest of that water goes towards the north, towards the West Fork that way. So you're kind of in the Clear Fork watershed technically.
Okay.
And it is on the flood risk viewer. You can see that on that viewer, that website that Stephen mentioned, and you can go and see how far up those go.
Could you mention that link again, Stephen?
Absolutely.
The QR code.
The QR code here, if you have your phone out.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Can't see it.
Yeah. Oh, you can't see it. Okay, but you will when you get you'll get the.
We can send the link.
Yeah.
I think I can share this PDF of the slides too, right, Jennifer?
Yeah.
Yes, yeah, we can share both the PDF and the recording afterwards. So, and we can include that link in the email as well.
Yeah.
So other questions? Let's see, Julie, we see you raising your hand.
Did I unmute myself?
Yes, we hear you.
Okay, I will ask a quick question. I got here late. The flood risk area, how and just is that's separate from FEMA flood requirement for insurance?
Yes.
Is that correct?
Correct. That's correct.
There's no
Okay.
mandatory requirement for a property within the CFRA like there is in the FEMA floodplain. You can still get the flood insurance and it will be cheaper because it's not in a FEMA floodplain.
That's a good question.
Plus, we also have a discount since we're in the CRS program, which is this community rating system program, and we're at a level 7. So everybody within the city gets a 15% discount on their premiums.
So just to expand a little bit on what that means, because of the types of activities that the city of Fort Worth does to regulate flood risks, to communicate flood risks, to keep our maps up to date, to appropriately permit development, all these different activities that we do, that gives us points, which in turn turns into a benefit to those who have flood insurance because they can get a discounted rate based off of the work that we do at the city.
So Jennifer, is that if you live in the, let's say you live on Pershing and you want to explore getting some flood insurance, would you go through FEMA or where would you go to apply for it?
So you can contact like your just typical insurance agent, and they can work to get you a policy through the National Flood Insurance Program. So in just any insurance agent should be able to get you that policy.
But it's not required because it's
No.
a FEMA floodplain. But would you recommend it if you lived down there?
So I'll say we say flood insurance is definitely, a way that property owners should consider to better protect their investments. And as Lisa said, typically it's probably going to be cheaper because it's not in a FEMA floodplain. And FEMA is constantly looking at how they evaluate properties and how they set their rates. So definitely we're not the rate experts, or changing all the time. But it definitely does not hurt to reach out and talk with your insurance agent. Also, we've got a great team and we do site visits, we do consultations. So if you've got questions really to better understand, the risk of your property, we're definitely happy to help you better understand your risk. And if there's things potentially you could do on your site to kind of help reduce your risk or mitigate that risk some, we're happy to give suggestions. So just reach out and we can get something set up for those who might be interested.
So
I had a follow-up question as well. I apologize. My property that my son lives in is catty cornered to the empty lot or whatever that's going to be developed into parking spaces, and it rolls right from that lot onto my property. And I just want to know who's going to be assessing the drainage on that. Because I'm going to get flood insurance a lot quicker if it's going to be like, y'all are going to go out there every 4 months, 6 months, whatever, and then see. Just because the way that when I pull up the GIS maps with the overlay of the floodway, I mean, it is going straight on to 4932 and my neighbor's property there on that lot in the alley. So I don't know if there's going to be an additional drain that's going to go into some kind of underwater, under earth sewer system or drainage system, but just wanted to check on that, on how quickly y'all are going to assess active water downpours that come in Texas, we found.
So right now, this project has been permitted and has been shown to be in compliance with our current regulations. So after we go and permit, we don't go into additional assessments or anything like that, but they have given us the information to show that what they can build is in compliance with our city regulations.
What happens if Julie has a problem and wants to report it to you all? Who would she call? The city councilwoman? Where would she go to say, hey, this is getting worse?
So I would say my first step is, because it's a recent new development, would be to reach out to development services. And we can, if it's like kind of during that process or right after it happens, because we would have had, recent communications with that developer. If it comes later, then it can come to our team and we can go out and do an evaluation. But the hope is that this parking lot is now going in with these new, informed by the new flood risk area mapping and regulations, and in compliance with our standards.
Jennifer, I'd like to add that if that site is currently flowing toward adjacent properties now, it will continue to flow toward adjacent properties now, even with the concrete parking lot. That, due to the size of that lot, that development, it doesn't fall under our typical reviews for drainage studies. So the only reason we saw that particular lot is because of the fence and the CFRA, but the CFRA was just to make sure that the review rather was to make sure the fence didn't exacerbate the situation, but it will continue to flow in the direction it's going now, just as a note.
And that's typical of any development. That's part of when developments go in, is looking at the flows to not like totally change things and like push the water in a different direction, but to kind of manage and maintain those existing flow paths. So that's common for any development.
And with that impervious cover, it may technically get there faster, and it will be, due to the fact that I think the existing ground was grass and now it's concrete. So technically there would be more flow, but that's not covered under CFRA or our current ordinance for a site this small.
And that's why we're looking at, how Stephen mentioned at the end of his presentation, why we're looking citywide at the impact of impervious surface to see if there's things that we should potentially be doing different or regulating different ways because of the more and more impervious surfaces.
Jennifer?
It sounds to me as if this is obviously going to increase the flow. The flow is going to be more rapid. If we've had flooding in the past, the flow is going to increase the flooding. Is that correct?
Because we have more flow now, since it's impervious.
Yeah.
So locally within the street or maybe the neighboring property, the alley, the increase in impervious cover would generate some additional flow. And hopefully they're actually directing to the street. It's hard to tell from the site plan, but if this is a curb opening, then maybe they're directing it towards the street where it's better able to be handled. But from a watershed perspective, we wouldn't expect to see increased flows, say on Hewland Street, for example.
Could Julie contact the stormwater department to come out and help her figure out how to protect her property better?
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And we do site visits frequently for people who have questions about, how to handle, their drainage or their neighbor's drainage better.
Interesting.
So could Molly and Ray call you too? Where do you guys live, Molly and Ray?
We're behind the gates. We're a little bit elevated.
Oh, okay.
But however, right in front of us, the block between Neville and Pentecost, the water has come up to the car levels that are parked on the street, into the doors up into the cars.
Mm-hmm.
So we cannot imagine that. I mean, that we're just thinking it's exacerbated now without a flow, a pervious.
With impervious surface.
So we don't really have that issue that we will be flooded, but we're just looking at our neighbors and our neighborhood.
Sure.
And I'm not sure where Julie is though. Yeah. Okay.
I'm on Pershing. So
Pershing and Pentecost?
We live.
I'm to the north of that corner lot, 4932 Pershing.
North.
So,
Okay.
well, I think it's north. I'm
I
looking at
couldn't, I don't
the,
think, north would be Laurel Campo.
North would be the
sorry,
back.
southeast. I'm on that
Yes.
corner. So the
South.
corner edge of the parking lot will now be the corner edge of my backyard, or with the alley. So it
Oh,
it
I got it.
follows that line. So you see that flood line there? That's where it is.
Yeah.
And and so I sell real estate in Huntsville, Alabama. My son's there in Fort Worth and works at Lockheed, and we invested in it because it's such a great neighborhood. But when I see somebody paying what they did for that lot just to put 8 parking spaces on it,
Yeah.
there's bigger issues here in the city, but there's definitely, and then I get this flood risk letter, which I'll have this. I don't know if this notifies FEMA, so FEMA's now going to put it in the floodway or the flood fringe. I've most parking lots, when you develop, have to have some kind of spillway or something, but I guess because this is smaller than your standard lot, it flies under the radar, so the city can't put some kind of additional provisions on it. So I need somebody to send me an email of the person that I can call on, the 911 that my back wall is flooded.
So she's right back here.
Mhm.
Yeah, I see where you are. Yeah, or your front end. Yeah.
So yeah,
I
we're
would like that as well. I would like that as well. I live next door to Julie, and my backyard does flood already. A few inches of water, and in the front of my house, it has covered my stairs completely. So I'm just a little bit worried too, like with this fence. How high did you say it was going to be raised so that water doesn't get pushed up into the alley and more water into my backyard?
I
It
want to
was at
say
Said
least
it
6 inches. Wasn't it at least 6 inches? Do you remember, Stephen?
it's on the order of 3 to 6 inches because it was going to
Yeah.
be a bit more than the flood depths. And so the average flood depth across the parking lot site was around 1 to 3 inches. And so I think we're going above that to make sure there was no obstruction. That's our
okay.
And
I
it-
just,
as
I
I say,
mean,
I do want to. Oh, go ahead. Finish. I'm sorry.
oh no, that's okay. You can go first. I'm curious what you have to say about the 6 inches.
Well, so the purpose of the 6 inches is to maintain that existing flow path. But I did want to touch on the comment about, is this sent to FEMA? So when we worked with stakeholders for several years to figure out how to regulate this area for the city of Fort Worth. And FEMA was involved in those discussions, and there was a discussion about. Oh, I hear myself twice. Okay, there was a discussion about, should these be added to the FEMA floodplain maps? And the stakeholders felt very strongly that they shouldn't, and we wanted to keep these as local city flood risk areas, not call them FEMA floodplains, not call them any kind of floodplains, because they're local, and we wanted that flexibility that regulating them locally gives us, so we can, tweak how we're doing our regulations for the best of the community. We can update our mapping very quickly if we need to, which if it becomes on a FEMA map, it takes a whole lot more effort and time to ever update FEMA maps. So I'm not going to say that FEMA couldn't just decide to take our information and do something with it differently, but we definitely had those discussions, and the whole plan was not to attempt to put these on the FEMA maps at all.
And Jennifer, I will find the building permit and email the exact distance or height that's shown on the plans, so everyone will have that. as far as the gap in the fence.
I have a question. I know this is after the fact, and I appreciate this information about the flood risk, et cetera. Prior to the lot being sold for a parking lot, I guess it had to go through the city council or a city thing. I called too late to do my protest.
Yeah.
But someone had to present a plan that this is all going to be copacetic. It's all going to work for all the flooding, right? And then the city council said, sure, or whomever said, sure, this is good. It's passed. Correct? So we shouldn't have any repercussions because it's been vetted already. That's the way I look at it. Am I correct in that? Thinking that, I mean, I would like it to be that way, that it's all, everything's going to go really great because we've looked at it. We've seen the plans. We've seen what they're doing. Am I being a little cynical or?
So we don't, because it's under 1 acre, we typically don't get into that level of review. So the fence was reviewed as part of the city flood risk area regulations because the fence requires a permit. The concrete in the street and the roadway itself require a permit, but all of the paving and concrete on the private property, there's no permit associated with that work.
Interesting.
And
Okay.
I want to add some more just add a little bit more context. If that property owner on this particular site had chosen to put in a fence less than 7 feet, then we wouldn't have seen anything as a permit goes. So he has the right to go out there and build that parking lot and those drive approaches. It's under 1 acre. There's no building associated with it. So the 7 foot, the above 7 foot is what triggered the CFRA review. So just being in CFRA doesn't necessarily always trigger a review unless, as Stephen has stated, there's a permit associated with it. I just want to make that fine point that if that fence were 6 feet, we would have never seen it.
So would that be the zoning change that was?
Right. So the zoning change, I believe, and there's no one on this call from zoning, and so I kind of want to know. I'm not the expert, but
Yeah.
let me tell you what I think I know. I believe the zoning, like the site plan comes in, it gets looked at by city staff, the zoning commission, and it goes to commission, and then it ends up going to city council for, I guess, discussion and approval. So the piece they're focused on is the use of the land, not the detailed drainage,
Right.
or the,
Okay.
that kind of stuff. I think the question they're answering is it okay to use this as a parking lot? So it's really the use that they're focused on.
Yeah.
Was this approved before July 24th when the new ordinance went into effect or after? Do you know?
I believe it's after. I don't know about the zoning, but the fence permit came in after, and that's why it was flagged for our review.
Okay.
And I have kind of a separate question that relates to just if something is deemed to be in a FEMA floodplain, are they required to have flood insurance or is it a choice?
So if they're in the FEMA floodplain and they have homeowners insurance, that's back. Lisa, what are the details of that? They've got to have a.
Yeah, if you have a structure, a business, or a home that's located in the FEMA floodplain and you have a federally backed mortgage, you're mandatorily required to have flood insurance and it goes along with the mortgage. And so it's kind of protection in case you do get flooded while you're still paying off your mortgage to make sure that you are able to repair your home.
But if someone pays off their mortgage, then you know they could drop their flood insurance.
It's not that expensive, is it? As I recall.
Yeah.
It depends on how deep your risk is. The deeper water you're in, the higher the cost. And coastal is a whole nother story. So luckily we're not coastal. So around here it is more reasonable than
Mhm.
other
I
locations.
don't think so.
Yeah.
So it usually runs when you're not required. I sell real estate, at least in Alabama, it's about $650. If you
We
are
didn't
in
have
it,
that much, did we?
you got to get a flood elevation certificate. Those run about $650, and that's where it shows where the house sits within the floodplain. And then it can go up to $2,000-$3,000 a year. So
Pretty
you just
high.
um, you gotta really get that information, and that's why I'm asking y'all these questions. Is, to me, just because this lot is too small that it flies under the radar, if a lot, if the city changes the zoning and allows it to be developed into a lot versus a house, and it sits in this yellow area, to me, it should have another layer of respect or inspection regarding the waterway, because we know this area floods. I mean, since we got the house, it's flooded like 3 times on the street. It's crazy. So, I mean, I don't know if that's something that y'all can recommend. I know that it was vetted, but it wasn't vetted for the drainage, because I submitted a very long letter about it and with photos and everything. And it's just kind of
And Julie,
slipped through. I mean, my lot is probably worth more without the house sitting on it now because of what this person paid for this land.
and Julie, has your house flooded? Has your house flooded?
The garage has flooded. So luckily the kids got the cars off the street before it got so deep, but across the street it was bad.
Okay, I was just curious.
So I think one thing to touch on is, instead of using this as a parking lot, someone could have built a home on this site, and then they would have had to pull a permit to build the home. That would have flagged the city flood risk area review. And so in that case, we would have reviewed the home. It would have had to been elevated or flood proofed. And then we would look at the flow paths and the impact of the flow paths around that home. But that home, that new addition of the impervious surface from the home would have been just kind of like the parking lot. Is that correct, Lisa or Stephen? I think I want to try to show that it's not just the parking lot. It could be a home or something else, and it's still those same types, and it goes back to kind of the impervious surface. And we know that that's a problem, and that's what we're trying to continue to look at our regulations to see what we can do about that.
That's correct. It could have been a home. The footprint of the building could have been up to 50% of the lot size. And there's nothing in our regulations that would prevent them from paving their backyard.
And what percentage of the lot is being paved with the parking lot?
That's a good question. I actually don't know the answer to that.
So the city's regulation is 50% lot coverage maximum,
There it is.
For the building footprint.
building footprint, but it doesn't count patios, sidewalks, driveways,
Ooh.
swimming pools, like you
I don't
said.
know about the patios, but yeah, it doesn't count driveways or
Yeah.
sidewalks.
So you could have put a house there and covered the whole thing with concrete and you couldn't have stopped it.
That would be a property owner's option based on current regulations.
That's what, when I'm looking at this, typically, like, someone has their front yards, they've got to, have some of that as the green. And then, yeah, they could typically build the house and have a, very, backyard that's very impervious. And that would still be allowed under our current regulation. So, and that's, again, where we know that this causes problems, just like you're bringing up. We hear this from everyone, and that's why we've been evaluating what could be done about this with the stakeholder group.
I met with the homeowner that lives right behind this, right across the alley. He said that, and he protested this for sure, But he did say he's pleased with what he's been able to see. They're bringing in this big gray stone to make, so it's not going to all be asphalt. I forgot, you must have had a percentage. It's going to be stone to have water penetrating around those trees and possibly in that landscaping area too. So it's maybe the best of the worlds that we're going to have for any development, be it a home or this lot, which is relatively small parking space. I'm not happy. I'd like a green lot where my dog can go. But anyway, um, anyway, it sounds like they are trying to do, the company is trying to do the best possible environmentally.
And that's, I've been told too, that they're looking at using permeable pavers. I just don't have any of the details behind that. So
There's a lot of rock in the lot now. There's a lot of white rock in there that you're going to use. So,
Well, and I was by there just this afternoon, driving home, and they are grading. They're actually spreading the rock, and then they're putting a porous type of. I understood it's not really a concrete. They're putting a porous type of substance over it, so it actually drains better. That's why the rock is going underneath it, from what I was told.
oh, good. Okay. Efforts are being made. Maybe our voices are being heard.
Well, and I think that's one of the big reasons for just the flood risk communication and our new city flood risk area process is that awareness. And so we want to make sure that developers and property owners are aware of the risk, because I mean, one, we want to make sure that it's built based off our standards. Two, I mean, someone could always come back and say, hey, you didn't consider this. So we're trying to get that information out there so it can be considered, so things can be designed better. We definitely, we acknowledge that there's gaps, that we're continuing to work to refine our regulations and improve them. It's going to take time, but we feel like that this is a step in the right direction.
We really appreciate the information, at least getting that out to everyone. And I think this is very helpful to, have good information going out to the neighbors, so we at least have a better understanding.
And we kind of thought too, this could be, this is a great case study. The regulations just went into effect again in July. And so we're going to continue to learn from these to improve these current regulations as continuing to look at impervious surface. The feedback that we got from all of y'all today, it continues to help us to document, the questions and the concerns about the impact of impervious surface, so we can take that and talk about it from the stakeholders. So it's not just saying it's a problem, but saying, there's members across the community that are concerned. So it's definitely helpful to hear that firsthand feedback for us to take back and share that with city staff and council members and so forth. Any other questions?
Jennifer, wouldn't it help if the neighbors, if it does flood down there, take photographs? That really helps you all understand where it's going. There's
And what
nothing
they're
like-
seeing.
Yeah. It's so important.
Yes, yeah, photographs are definitely helpful for us because lots of times we can't get out there when the flooding's happening, just because of access, or we're not nearby, or we're responding somewhere else. But the more photos and better documentation we have, we can use that to, try to go after funding or to better understand what could be done, because we can really get a better understanding of the type of flood risk, the depth, the expanse, that type of information. So yes, all of that
Video
information is
clips
very
too.
helpful. Yes, videos, yeah. Okay. Any other questions?
I would like to ask one other question pertaining to this process. So y'all have this committee. When does FEMA redraw their maps for that area? Is there a timeline on that? I know they usually do it like every 2 or 3 years. And would we be given a heads up if we're going to be put in a flood fringe or, anything with FEMA? I know the city is one level and FEMA is another.
So I think it would help, Stephen, to go back to that slide that showed the potential high water. So in this western Arlington Heights area, there is no FEMA floodplain. So FEMA typically maps a floodplain along major creeks and channels. So in y'all's area, the flood risk that's been mapped has been this local flood risk by the city of Fort Worth. So go back to the orange just because that's the more detailed flood risk mapping. So at this point in time, I would say we don't expect this to change unless the city is able to go out and do a project to significantly mitigate this, which, as we were saying, is very challenging to do. That's not on our list right now, and that's why we're really trying to make sure that at least we are able to communicate and regulate as best as possible, because this city flood risk that we have goes across much of the central city of Fort Worth. And so it just makes it challenging to tackle. We're trying to tackle it over time, but it's going to just take a really long time. And that's what we want to do to make sure that we're regulating, we're communicating, we're warning, and we're also doing mitigation, as well as that we're maintaining the drainage system out in this area. So what we do is we do scheduled checks of our inlets to make sure that they're clean, our storm drain pipe. If y'all ever have concerns or you see it looks like an inlet's not draining or it could be clogged, please call us, because we'll come out there and check that and look and open it up or TV the lines. So if y'all ever have concerns that something's wrong with the storm drain system, we'll want to come out there and inspect that. So that's another thing that we do, is we want to make sure that we know the drainage systems in these older parts of town that were developed a long time ago. They're not up to today's standards. So we want to make sure that at least we're maintaining them to the best of our abilities, so they're able to function at least how they were designed.
Jennifer, so a FEMA, if this area were to be considered by FEMA, is FEMA flooding mostly from rivers, creeks, that kind of thing? And this is just classic flash flood, urban flooding from too much
Yes.
impervious surface, basically.
Yes. So a long time ago, before this area was developed, there was probably an old stream or channel or swale that flowed through this area that carried the water. And just a long time ago, when the area was developed, people didn't realize the intensity of development that we would have today. And so when the storm drain systems were put in with that development, they were just built to a smaller size than we would today. And we've got this similar situation all across older areas of Fort Worth. And it's not just a Fort Worth problem. It's cities that have been around for a long time. This is a nationwide issue that when we worked over the last, I would say, like 7 years on this, we did a lot of benchmarking and work with other communities to see what they were doing. And we were informed with a lot of nationwide studies, because it wasn't just Fort Worth trying to figure out how to tackle the same situation, but it's cities across the nation with the same problem. Okay, well, I know it's 7:15, so we appreciate everybody sticking on. I think the discussion was really good. If you think of questions after the fact, don't hesitate to reach out. If you don't have my email, it was in the chat, but feel free to send something to Christina or Councilmember Hill or Sammy, and they'll get the questions back to us and we'll respond. Again, the meeting was recorded, and so we will send out that recording and the PowerPoint file as a PDF after the meeting, but we'll need your email. So if you weren't there at the beginning, reach out to somebody at the city, send them your email, or reach out to Christina or Lori at the Arlington Heights Neighborhood Association, send them your email, and someone will get you the presentation information. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you all. Y'all have a good night.
Appreciate it. Thanks, y'all.